The wind swept across the frozen surface of Salmon River, carrying a sharp sting that cut through fur hoods and stiff mittens. Sled dogs waited in tight lines on the ice, their breath hanging in pale clouds that caught the first gray light of morning. The sky was low, the kind of heavy winter sky interior Alaska knew well, pressing down on the river valley with a weight that made every sound seem distant. Behind the dogs, smoke curled from the pipe of a small log cabin built into the bank. Inside that cabin, a hush had settled, too deep, too complete for an ordinary morning. Old Man Pitka lay on a spruce bough bed against the back wall, wrapped in caribou hides, his breath scraping shallowly in his chest. His sons, Pitka and Theodore, knelt close, one holding a cup of warm broth, the other adjusting the hides around their father's sunken shoulders. The stove gave off a steady heat, but it did little for the man whose strength had drained away over weeks of fever. This winter had brought sickness into the remote camps along the upper Kuskokwim, the same kind of sickness that had torn through other bands years earlier, measles, influenza, names people didn't know, but symptoms they recognized all too well. For generations, the people of Salmon River had lived in scattered camps and seasonal settlements, tied to fish runs, trap lines, and trails along the forks of the Kuskokwim. Their families had weathered many winters, but the diseases carried upriver by traders, missionaries, and travelers were different. They spread through small communities with a speed that stunned even the elders. Houses upriver on the McKinley Fork had gone quiet. Families on the Middle Fork had fled. Entire clusters of cabins near Vinasale had fallen into silence. People spoke of a few survivors making their way toward larger villages, Nikolai, Telida, where an Orthodox priest held services, where more hands could share the work of staying alive. The Pitka family knew these stories, but Salmon River was home. They had fished these waters for generations. They had worn trails into the hills, left caches of dried salmon along the banks, and buried their dead on the ridges where the river bends. Staying felt like honoring that history. Leaving felt like abandoning it. But the sickness had taken hold early in the winter. First, Huekla grew weak, then Mary, then Theodore. The children coughed through the nights, unable to sleep. The woodpile shrank. Meals grew thin. Every day, more neighbors fell ill in the nearby cabins until hardly anyone was strong enough to help anyone else. The cabin grew warmer as the stove burned through the last of the stacked spruce, but heat couldn't hide the truth. Old Man Pitka's breath rattled and slowed. When he finally exhaled for the last time, the entire family knew instantly. No cries filled the room, only a deep, aching silence. The younger children slept pressed into their mothers' sides. The older ones stared at the floorboards, their eyes shining in the lamplight. Outside, the dogs shifted restlessly, their paws scraping on the ice. There was no time to wait. The ground was frozen stiff, but the men worked with axes and shovels on a low ridge above the river, cutting through layers of ice and frost to make a resting place. The burial was brief, the cold too sharp to linger. They lowered Old Man Pitka into the ground beside others who had died in earlier winters. The wind carried the sound of the shovel blades, metallic and final, across the silent river. When the family returned to the cabin, a quiet decision settled over them, unspoken but undeniable. Salmon River, once strong with many families, had become too small to survive another sweep of illness. If more adults fell sick, no one would be left to cut wood, hunt game, or gather water. The children needed safety, needed more people caring for them. The trails leading to the main villages offered a kind of hope: warm houses, other families, and a priest who could bury the dead and bless the living. And so the work of leaving began. The cabin filled with the sounds of packing, bundles of dried salmon tied tightly for travel, caribou hides rolled and lashed together, kettles and cups wrapped in cloth to muffle the clatter. The family argued gently over what to take and what to leave. A few tools stayed behind. Some old traps were hung back on their nails. A carving that had belonged to old man Pitka remained on the shelf, a silent acknowledgement that they might never return long enough to claim it. Dogs were harnessed at first light, their bodies trembling with energy. Sled runners were scraped smooth. The children were bundled so tightly in fur that only their eyes were visible above their scarves. The moment the last line was tied, the family paused, looking back at the cabin. Smoke no longer rose from the pipe. Snow had begun drifting against the door. It already looked abandoned. When the dogs finally lunged forward, the sleds slid across the hard river ice, cutting the first tracks of a long journey. The trail followed the frozen river, curving past the mouth of the Pitka Fork, where the family's ancestors had lived for generations. Spruce on the banks rose dark and quiet, their branches heavy with frost. The cold bit at exposed skin, but movement kept them warm. They stopped only to melt river ice for tea and to let the dogs rest. Some nights, coughs still tore through the camp as fever clung to the adults. But each morning they resumed the trail, driven by the knowledge that survival meant reaching other people. Days into the journey, faint sled tracks appeared ahead of them, weaving along the riverbank. Then, one afternoon, a distant caravan came into view, a cluster of sleds, dogs, and people bundled against the cold. It was another band from upriver, also fleeing the sickness. When the two groups met on the ice, the relief was immediate. Stories and food were exchanged, and the sleds were tied into a longer line. By the time the river bent near the mouth of the Tanzona, the smell of many fires drifted through the air. A cluster of cabins appeared on the bank, smoke rising from their pipes in steady streams. Dogs barked. Children ran between doorways. Adults hauled wood and water, their movements quick and practiced. This was the settlement that had begun drawing families from across the region, the village that would become Nikolai. The newcomers were greeted with embraces, shared meals, and a place to warm themselves. They brought news of the upper river, stories of sickness and survival, and memories of homes they had left behind. Over the following years, the Pitka family traveled back to Salmon River in summer to fish and hunt, but each winter pulled them back to the safety of Nikolai and later to Telida. As the years passed, no male children remained to carry the Pitka name at Salmon River. The old camp emptied, the cabins collapsed under snow, trails faded. Only the river, the ridges, and the stories kept the memory alive. People in Nikolai and Telida still talk about those winters, about families who left everything they knew along the frozen rivers, about nights spent on spruce boughs, about the silence that followed an elder's last breath. They speak of the strength it took to leave, the courage it took to arrive, and the way those journeys shaped the villages that stand today. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.